Welcome to Declassified. In this series, we pull back the curtain on stories you think you know, revealing the hidden histories and secret operations that shaped our world.
Today, we journey back to a moment of international crisis, a story of espionage so audacious it could only have come from Hollywood. Or so the movie would have you believe. This is the story of Argo. Not the film, but the reality. It's a tale of revolution, of hostages, and of 6 Americans who vanished into thin air. But to understand how they got out, you first have to understand how they got in. Our story begins not in 1979, but more than a quarter of a century earlier, with a ghost that would haunt a nation.
November 4th, 1979. Tehran, Iran. The air outside the United States Embassy is thick with revolutionary fervor. It's a cold, gray morning, but the energy of the crowd is electric, a human storm gathering at the gates of what many here see as the heart of a foreign poison in their land, the den of spies. Inside the sprawling 27-acre compound, the American staff, their numbers already slashed from over 1,400 before the revolution to a skeleton crew of about 70, can hear the fury building. They've seen protests before. Just months earlier, on February 14th, the embassy was briefly overrun in an attack that left several wounded. But this feels different. This feels final.
The mob, initially estimated at a few hundred but swelling to perhaps 3,000 militant students, begins to scale the walls. They are followers of the revolution's spiritual leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and they are enraged. Their catalyst is a decision made half a world away in Washington, D.C. President Jimmy Carter has allowed the deposed, terminally ill Shah of Iran into the United States for cancer treatment. To the revolutionaries, this isn't an act of humanitarianism. It's a prelude to a second act, a terrifying echo of a history they know all too well. They fear the CIA is preparing to reinstall the hated monarch, just as they did in 1953.
Inside the main embassy building, the Chancery, chaos erupts. Marines fire tear gas. Staff rush to shred sensitive documents, the machines overheating and blowing fuses in their frantic effort to erase American intelligence from Iranian soil. But the gates are breached. The students pour into the compound, armed with sticks and rocks, their chants now echoing inside the corridors of American power. The siege is short. Within a few hours, it's over. 66 Americans are taken captive, blindfolded, their hands bound. Their ordeal, a 444-day nightmare broadcast to a horrified world, is just beginning.
But in a separate consular building on the compound, a small group of State Department employees watches the pandemonium unfold. They hear the yells. They see the figures running across the grounds. Someone shouts to lock the doors. A split-second decision is made. As the main embassy falls, 5 of them, consular officers Robert Anders, Mark Lijek, and Joseph Stafford, along with their wives, Cora Lijek and Kathleen Stafford, slip out a side exit. They melt into the chaotic streets of Tehran, a city that has just become the most dangerous place on earth for an American. Elsewhere on the compound, another American, agricultural attaché Lee Schatz, sees the takeover begin, calmly walks out of his own building, and disappears into the crowd.
52 of their colleagues would become the face of an international crisis, their captivity a daily fixture on the nightly news. But these 6? They vanished. They became ghosts in a hostile city, hunted by a revolutionary regime determined to find them. How did they escape not just the embassy, but an entire nation? How did they stay hidden for 79 agonizing days? And how did they finally get out? The answer is a story of incredible courage, of quiet heroism, and of a plan so bizarre, so steeped in the fantasy of Hollywood, that it remains one of the most audacious covert operations in CIA history. It's a story far more complex, more collaborative, and ultimately more human than any movie. This is the declassified, true story of the Canadian caper.
To understand the rage directed at the American embassy in 1979, we have to travel back in time, to 1951. The central figure of this era wasn't a king or a cleric, but a frail, aristocratic, and deeply patriotic man named Mohammad Mossadegh. He was an unlikely icon of the people. A wealthy lawyer educated in Europe, he was known for his eccentricities. He would often receive foreign dignitaries while wearing his pajamas, conduct government business from his bed, which was sometimes carried into the parliament chambers for him, and was prone to dramatic bouts of public weeping during speeches. But beneath this peculiar exterior was a steely resolve and a political fire forged decades earlier.
Mossadegh had been a fierce opponent of the 1925 military coup that brought Reza Khan to power as the first Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, an act of defiance that forced him into political retirement for years. By the early 1950s, he had re-emerged as the leader of a democratic nationalist movement and was elected Prime Minister of Iran. His defining mission, the cause that made him a hero to millions of Iranians, was aimed at a single, powerful entity, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AOC. For decades, this British corporation, the forerunner of modern-day BP, held a complete monopoly over Iran's colossal oil reserves. It was, in effect, a state within a state. It operated its own facilities, its own security, and its own towns. And while it extracted immense wealth from Iranian soil, it paid the nation a pittance in royalties, a deal struck in an earlier, colonial era that Iranians now viewed as a national humiliation.
Mossadegh sought to renegotiate. He simply asked to audit the company's books to verify that Iran was receiving its contractually owed share. The AIOC, with the backing of the British government, flatly refused. In response, in March 1951, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, led by Mossadegh, did the unthinkable. They voted to nationalize the entire oil industry. To Iranians, it was a declaration of economic independence, a moment of profound national pride. To the British Empire, reeling from the loss of India and protective of its remaining global assets, it was an act of theft, a catastrophic threat to its economic interests and prestige. The stage was set for a confrontation, not just between a company and a country, but between a rising tide of post-colonial nationalism and the fading grip of an old empire.
Britain's first response was to flex its muscle. It mobilized its military, threatening to seize the Abadan refinery, then the world's largest. But the government of Prime Minister Clement Attlee opted for a more insidious strategy: economic warfare. The British Navy blockaded Iran's ports, and London orchestrated a global boycott of Iranian oil, crippling the nation's economy. When Mossadegh refused to buckle, the British turned to espionage, using Iranian agents to undermine his government from within. Their goal was to convince the young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to dismiss the popular prime minister. The ploy failed, only serving to enhance Mossadegh's reputation while diminishing the Shah's.
It was then that the idea of a full-blown coup d'état began to take shape. But Britain, its power waning on the world stage, was reluctant to act alone. It needed a partner, a global superpower with the resources and the covert capabilities to topple a government. It needed the United States. Initially, President Harry Truman's administration was opposed. They feared the precedent that such a brazen CIA intervention would set. But with the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 and the rise of the fiercely anti-communist Dulles brothers, John Foster as Secretary of State and Allen as Director of the CIA, the mood in Washington shifted.
The British skillfully played on America's Cold War anxieties. They painted Mossadegh, a staunch anti-communist himself, as a man who was dangerously aligning with Iran's Tudeh, or Communist, party. It was a calculated piece of disinformation, but in the zero-sum game of the Cold War, it worked. The United States took the lead in a joint covert operation codenamed Ajax, or Operation Ajax. At the highest levels of the American government, President Eisenhower gave his formal approval. On the ground in Tehran, the operation was orchestrated by one man, senior CIA officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt.
What followed in August 1953 was a masterclass in political destabilization, a dark blueprint for covert action that the CIA would replicate for decades. The plan was not to use American soldiers, but to make it look like Iran was collapsing from within. Over 4 frantic days, Roosevelt and his agents put the CIA's playbook into action. They bought off journalists and newspaper editors, flooding the press with anti-Mossadegh propaganda and outright lies. They recruited allies among the Islamic clergy, turning religious sentiment against the secular prime minister. And most effectively, they hired some of Tehran's most feared mobsters and street thugs to stage violent, pro-Shah riots. CIA-funded agents fomented unrest, harassing political and religious leaders to create an atmosphere of chaos and fear.
The plan nearly failed. The first attempt at a coup fizzled when the Shah, a notoriously indecisive monarch, vacillated over signing the royal decrees the CIA had prepared to dismiss Mossadegh and sanction the change of government. Mossadegh's forces learned of the plot and fought back. The prime minister went on the radio and announced victory, and the Shah, fearing for his throne and his life, fled the country. For a moment, it seemed Mossadegh had won.
But Kermit Roosevelt hadn't given up. He orchestrated a second, more forceful push. With millions of dollars in CIA cash, his agents paid for more protesters to be brought into Tehran by bus and truck, taking over the streets. This time, the manufactured chaos took hold. On August 19, 1953, in a day of bloody street fighting that left some 300 people dead, the Iranian army, led by pro-Shah General Fazlollah Zahedi, moved against Mossadegh's government. The democratically elected prime minister was overthrown.
Mossadegh was arrested, put on trial for treason by a military court, and sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by house arrest for the remainder of his life. The Shah was flown back to Iran and restored to the peacock throne, no longer a constitutional monarch, but an absolute ruler, propped up and protected by the United States. For decades, the CIA's role was a subject of speculation and denial. But in 2013, and again in a 2023 podcast, the agency formally and publicly admitted its central role, acknowledging that the coup was carried out under CIA direction and as an act of U.S. foreign policy, conceived and approved at the highest levels of government. The ghost of 1953 was, officially, no longer a ghost. It was a fact.
The 26 years that followed the coup were a period of profound contradiction for Iran. On the surface, under the restored rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the country experienced a period of unprecedented modernization and economic growth, fueled by a flood of oil revenue. The Shah, with heavy American backing, launched his White Revolution, a top-down program of land reform, industrial development, and social changes, including granting women the right to vote. Tehran became a cosmopolitan hub, a glamorous playground for the global elite. The Shah and his empress were frequent guests at the White House, and American presidents praised him as a visionary leader, a bastion of stability in a volatile region.
But this glittering facade concealed a dark and brutal reality. The Shah's power was absolute, and he maintained it with an iron fist. The foundation of his rule was SAVAK, his notoriously cruel secret police force. Trained and supported by the CIA and Israeli intelligence, SAVAK became a symbol of the regime's terror. Dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. Political opponents, students, intellectuals, and clerics were arrested, imprisoned, and tortured. All political parties were banned, and all Iranians were required to join the single, state-sanctioned Rastakist party. The Shah's Iran was a golden cage, a place of outward progress and wealth for a select few, built upon a bedrock of fear, repression, and the denial of basic political freedoms.
This history is not merely background context for the events of 1979. It is the essential driving force behind them. The 1953 coup was the foundational trauma of modern U.S.-Iran relations, an original sin that poisoned the well for a generation. To understand the chain of events that led directly to the embassy takeover, one must follow the logic of that trauma. First, the United States and Britain overthrew a beloved, democratically elected leader primarily to protect their corporate oil interests. Second, this action installed an autocratic monarch who was, from that day forward, completely dependent on American political, economic, and military support to hold on to power.
As a result, in the minds of millions of Iranians, the Shah's regime and the United States government became inextricably linked. They were two sides of the same coin. Every grievance against the Shah's opulent corruption, every story of Savak's brutality, every frustration with the widening gap between the rich elite and the impoverished masses was also a grievance against his American sponsors. This dynamic transformed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran from a simple diplomatic mission into a potent and hated symbol. It was seen as the operational headquarters of the Great Satan, the foreign power that had stolen their democracy in 1953 and sustained a tyrant for 26 years. This is why, when the revolution finally boiled over, the embassy was not just a target, it was the target.
Furthermore, the perceived success of Operation Ajax had consequences that rippled far beyond Iran. Emboldened by its ability to topple a foreign government with relative ease and at a low cost, the CIA replicated the blueprint. Just 1 year later, in 1954, the agency orchestrated a similar coup in Guatemala, overthrowing a democratically elected government to protect the interests of the United Fruit Company. This intervention plunged Guatemala into a 40-year civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The coup in Iran became a template for Cold War covert action, a dangerous and repeatable model of intervention with devastating, long-term consequences for global stability and America's own moral standing.
By the late 1970s, the Shah's golden cage was beginning to rust from within. Decades of repressed anger were simmering just below the surface. All it needed was a spark. That spark came in January 1978. A government-controlled newspaper, Adalat, published a slanderous article viciously attacking Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the Shah's most prominent clerical critic, who had been living in exile since 1964. The article denounced him as a British agent and a mad Indian poet.
The response was immediate. Seminary students in the holy city of Qom took to the streets in protest. The Shah's security forces responded with live ammunition, killing several demonstrators. This act of violence set off a chain reaction that would consume the country. In Shi'ar tradition, mourning ceremonies are held on the 40th day after a death. 40 days after the Qom massacre, memorial protests erupted in the city of Tabriz. Those protests were also met with violence, leading to more deaths. And 40 days after that, another wave of protests in dozens of cities mourned the dead of Tabriz. This cycle of protest, violence, and mourning created a powerful, self-sustaining revolutionary momentum.
Throughout 1978, the crisis escalated. In August, a horrific fire at the Cinema Rex movie theater in the city of Abadan killed over 400 people who were locked inside. Though evidence later suggested it was the work of Islamist militants, the public overwhelmingly believed it was a false flag operation by Savak, designed to discredit the opposition. The fire poured gasoline on the flames of public rage, leading to massive nationwide demonstrations. The Shah, seemingly caught off guard by the scale of the uprising, vacillated between concession and crackdown. He offered to hold democratic elections, relax censorship, and arrested some famously corrupt officials. But it was too little, too late.
On September 8, 1978, a day that would become known as Black Friday, the government declared martial law. Thousands of protesters defied the ban and gathered in Tehran's Jaleh Square. Troops opened fire directly into the crowd, killing dozens and wounding hundreds. The massacre shattered any remaining hope of a peaceful resolution.
By the fall, the revolution entered its final phase. Widespread strikes, particularly in the vital oil industry, paralyzed the nation's economy and cut off the regime's lifeblood. From his new base in a suburb of Paris, Ayatollah Khomeini, now a global figure thanks to the international media, blanketed Iran with smuggled cassette tapes of his sermons, calling for the complete overthrow of the monarchy. In December, during the holy month of Muharram, millions upon millions of Iranians, by some estimates, between 6 and 9 million people, marched in the streets in the largest protest event in human history, demanding the Shah's departure and Khomeini's return.
The army began to disintegrate, with soldiers deserting or refusing to fire on the people. The Shah's authority had evaporated. On January 16, 1979, fatally ill with cancer and with his country in open revolt, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi boarded a plane and flew into exile, never to return. 2 weeks later, on February 1st, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran in triumph, greeted by a sea of millions of ecstatic supporters. The revolution had won.
For 9 months after the revolution's victory, a tense and uncertain peace held between the new Iranian government and the United States. Iran was governed by a provisional, more moderate government led by Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan, who was attempting to navigate the treacherous waters of post-revolutionary politics and establish some form of working relationship with Washington. But hardline factions, deeply loyal to Khomeini and virulently anti-American, were maneuvering for control. The fragile détente was shattered in October 1979. The Carter administration, facing intense pressure from powerful figures like Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller, made a fateful decision. They agreed to allow the now deposed and gravely ill Shah into the United States for urgent medical treatment.
U.S. officials informed Prime Minister Bazargan, who gave assurances that the American embassy would be protected. But on the streets of Tehran, the news was interpreted through the lens of 1953. It was seen as undeniable proof that the U.S. was sheltering the hated tyrant and plotting his return to power. The outrage was explosive. On the morning of November 4th, the students made their move. A mob that grew to some 3,000 people, organized and directed by radical Islamist student groups, descended on the U.S. Embassy. After a siege of only a few hours, they breached the compound's defenses and swarmed the buildings. They captured 66 Americans, including the 3 who were seized at the Iranian Foreign Ministry building nearby.
This act, however, was more than just an expression of anti-American fury. It was a calculated move in a ruthless internal power struggle. It was, in effect, a revolution within the revolution. The student militants who stormed the embassy were not acting on the orders of Prime Minister Bazargan's provisional government. They were followers of Ayatollah Khomeini's hardline clerical faction. By taking American diplomats hostage, they created a crisis that the moderate government could not control.
The students' demand was simple and absolute. The United States must extradite the Shah to Iran to stand trial for his crimes. When the U.S. refused, Ayatollah Khomeini gave his public blessing to the students' actions. He praised them for attacking the den of spies and refused to order the hostages' release. This endorsement was the critical move. It completely undermined the authority of the moderates. 2 days later, on November 6th, Prime Minister Bazargan and his entire cabinet resigned in protest, recognizing they had been outmaneuvered. The hostage crisis effectively served as a coup, allowing the radical clerical establishment to sideline all secular and moderate voices, seize complete control of the state, and consolidate power.
The 52 Americans who remained in captivity for the next 444 days were not just hostages, they were pawns in the final, brutal consolidation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And 6 of their colleagues were now fugitives, alone in a city that had just declared war on their country.
For the 6 Americans who had slipped through the net, the first few days were a blur of fear and uncertainty. The group of 5 led by Robert Anders began a 6-day odyssey through the streets of Tehran, moving from one supposed safe house to another. They were aided by a brave Thai cook named Sam Sriwanich, who had keys to the homes of several American officials. They spent one tense night at the British residential compound, but it soon became clear that was too dangerous, as demonstrators were gathering outside. They were back on the street, running out of options, and, just as critically, running out of money. They were still hoping the crisis would end quickly, just as the February takeover had. But when Prime Minister Bazargan's government collapsed 3 days into their ordeal, they realized they were in for a long haul.
It was then that Robert Anders remembered an old friend, a Canadian he used to play tennis with. His name was John Sheardown, and he was the chief immigration officer at the Canadian Embassy. Anders made a desperate phone call. For days after the embassy takeover, the phone rang in John Sheardown's 20-room rented home. It was Bob Anders, explaining their dire situation and asking for shelter. Sheardown didn't hesitate. His immediate, enthusiastic reply would become legendary. "Hell, yes. Of course. Count on us." By some accounts, he even added, "Why didn't you call sooner?"
Sheardown immediately consulted his boss, Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor. Taylor, a sharp and decisive diplomat who had already proven his mettle by evacuating 850 Canadians when the Shah's regime first collapsed, was equally resolute. The Americans would be given shelter. The only question was where. The Canadian Chancery, or Embassy Office, was downtown and far too exposed. Taylor made a crucial strategic decision. They would split the group up to minimize risk. He instructed Sheardown to take 3 of the Americans to his house, while he and his wife, Pat, would house the other 2 at the official ambassador's residence. To their household staff, the Americans would be explained away as Canadian tourists visiting for a few days.
Taylor immediately drafted a top-secret cable to Ottawa. The request set off a flurry of urgent consultations. In the Department of External Affairs, senior officials Michael Shenstone and Alan Gottlieb quickly concurred. Despite the immense risk to Canadian lives and property, Gottlieb noted there was, in all conscience, no alternative. The Foreign Affairs Minister, Flora MacDonald, was pulled out of a television interview. She agreed, but stressed that the final decision had to come from the top. She pulled Prime Minister Joe Clark out of question period in the House of Commons, briefed him on the situation, and received his immediate, unequivocal go-ahead. A cable was sent back to Tehran. Taylor had full authority to act.
The next day, the 5 Americans were collected. The Staffords went with Ambassador Taylor, and Anders and the Lijeks went home with John Sheardown. Canada had just committed a profound act of courage, stepping into one of the most dangerous geopolitical crises of the era.
Thus began 79 days of surreal domesticity, a life of crushing boredom punctuated by moments of sheer, heart-stopping terror. For the house guests, as they were secretly known in diplomatic cables, time slowed to a crawl. Their days were filled with reading every book they could find, listening to BBC and Voice of America news reports for any scrap of information, and playing endless, competitive games of Scrabble. They drank, as Mark Lijek later recalled, quite a lot too.
But this was no vacation. Every ring of the telephone, every knock on the door, sent a jolt of adrenaline through the houses. They knew that the militants at the U.S. Embassy had access to personnel files and property leases. It was only a matter of time before they started checking the addresses of escaped employees. The Americans worried constantly about the danger they were putting their Canadian hosts in. What would happen if they were discovered? What if one of them got sick and needed a doctor? The psychological strain was immense.
The quiet, daily heroism fell largely on the shoulders of their Canadian protectors. Ambassador Taylor had to maintain the full schedule of a diplomat, attending meetings and functions, all while hiding two fugitives in his home and acting as a secret intelligence channel for the U.S. government. John Sheardown also went to the office every day. But it was his wife, Zena Sheardown, who bore the greatest burden. A British citizen by birth, she had no diplomatic immunity, placing her at the most extreme personal risk. For nearly 3 months, she rarely left the house. She became the guardian of the secret, the buffer against the outside world. She had to devise ingenious ways to manage a household with 4 extra people without arousing suspicion, buying groceries at different shops each day, and having John dispose of the extra trash on his way to work.
As Zena later recalled, I didn't dare think about the consequences. I just knew I had to put one foot in front of the other, keep going, because people's lives were dependent on us being strong. A few weeks into their stay, the secret family grew. On November 21st, Ambassador Taylor received a call from his Swedish colleague, Kai Sundberg. The 6th escapee, agricultural attaché Lee Schatz, had been hiding first at the Swedish embassy and then in the apartment of a Swedish consul. The Swedes were growing nervous. They felt Schatz, an American, could more easily pass as a Canadian and would be safer under Taylor's protection. Taylor agreed without hesitation. Schatz was moved to the Sheardown residence, joining the others.
U.S. Thanksgiving was celebrated at the Sheardown house, with the Americans grimly hoping they wouldn't still be there for Christmas. They were. As the holiday passed, Schatz joked that they should start planning for Easter. No one laughed.
Beneath the surface of this unified story of survival, however, lay hidden complexities and deep psychological tolls. The common narrative portrays the 6 as a cohesive and lucky group, but the reality was far more fraught with internal conflict and moral doubt. This was not a simple hero story. Joseph Stafford, in particular, was deeply conflicted about the idea of escaping. He felt they were abandoning their 52 colleagues who remained hostage, a profound moral dilemma that weighed on him heavily. He initially voted against the escape plan, a fact entirely omitted from the Hollywood version of the story. His reluctance stemmed from a belief that their duty was to stay, and that their capture might even complicate things less than their secret presence in the city. The others felt differently, believing their discovery would only make a horrific situation worse, potentially leading to accusations of espionage that could endanger all the hostages. This fundamental disagreement created a quiet but significant rift within the group.
Furthermore, the trauma of the experience did not end when they left Iran. Kathleen Stafford, an avid painter, found that after the escape, she suffered from intense survivor's guilt. She had recurring nightmares that she was on a plane with the other hostages, but they wouldn't speak to her. For a year, she found she couldn't paint. Every canvas she started, she ruined. It was only after the remaining 52 hostages were finally released in 1981, when she flew to meet them and celebrate their freedom, that the dream stopped and she could paint again. Their escape was a victory, but it was one that came with a hidden, lasting price.
As Christmas 1979 came and went, with the house guests still trapped in Tehran, it became clear in Washington that diplomacy alone wasn't going to get them out. The risk of discovery was growing every day. A Canadian journalist was getting dangerously close to the truth, and a leak in the Canadian Foreign Ministry had already compromised the secret. A more creative solution was needed. The problem landed on the desk of the Central Intelligence Agency's Office of Technical Service, a division that was, in essence, the real-life equivalent of Q's lab in the James Bond films. And the man tasked with solving it was the CIA's top exfiltration specialist, Tony Mendez.
Mendez was an unlikely spy. He had a background not in military operations, but as an artist. He was recruited by the CIA in 1965 through a blind ad for a graphic artist and quickly became a master of forgery, disguise, and what the agency called deception operations. For 25 years, He worked undercover in the hottest zones of the Cold War, creating new identities and appearances for thousands of clandestine operatives, allowing them to move like ghosts across hostile borders. He was, by trade, a professional liar, an illusionist whose medium was reality itself.
But Mendez would not go to Iran alone. He had a partner, a man whose role in this story was so secret that his very identity remained classified for more than 4 decades. He was known in agency files only by his cover name, Julio. It wasn't until September 2023, in a CIA podcast, that the world finally learned his name, Ed Johnson. Johnson was a brilliant and quiet CIA linguist, an expert in the art of moving people out of dangerous places. Fluent in German, French, Spanish, and Arabic, he was the perfect complement to Mendez's creative flair. While Mendez was the architect of the grand deception, Johnson was the meticulous technician who would help ensure it didn't fall apart under pressure. Together, they were tasked with concocting a plan to walk 6 Americans out of a country that was hunting for them.
The CIA considered and discarded several cover stories. Posing the 6 as unemployed teachers looking for work or as nutritionists studying Iranian crops, all were deemed too mundane, too likely to attract suspicion. It was while on the phone with his son, watching the movie Battle for the Planet of the Apes, that Mendez had his epiphany. The plan had to be the opposite of mundane. As he later put it, what if we designed a cover story so fantastic that nobody would believe it was being used for operational purposes? The 6 Americans would pose as a Canadian film crew, scouting locations for a Hollywood science fiction blockbuster.
To make the lie believable, Mendez needed to build an entire fictional world around it. And for that, he needed Hollywood. He reached out to a man who was already a trusted, if secret, CIA contractor, John Chambers, the legendary makeup artist who had won an Oscar for his groundbreaking work on Planet of the Apes and had created Spock's iconic ears for Star Trek. Chambers was the key. He knew how Hollywood worked, and he knew how to make a fake production look real. Together, they set up a dummy company, Studio 6 Productions, a subtle nod to the 6 people they were trying to rescue. They rented a real office at the Sunset Gower Studios in Hollywood, in the very suite just vacated by Michael Douglas after he finished filming The China Syndrome. They printed business cards, designed a logo, and had a phone line installed that was answered by a real person in on the ruse. The deception was so convincing that actual producers, including a young Steven Spielberg, sent legitimate film proposals to the fake studio.
All they needed now was a script. And here, fate provided an almost unbelievable gift. John Chambers had in his possession the script and production materials for a defunct sci-fi epic called Lord of Light. Based on a novel by Roger Zelazny, it was the brainchild of a producer named Barry Geller, who had hired the single most legendary artist in comic book history, Jack Kirby, the co-creator of Captain America, the Fantastic Four, and the X-Men, to create stunning, otherworldly concept art for the film. Geller's project, which also involved plans for a massive science fiction land theme park in Colorado, had collapsed in a financial scandal, but the script and Kirby's incredible drawings remained.
Mendez saw them and knew he had struck gold. The story, a mystical science fiction tale set on a colonized planet, was perfect. The rugged, dramatic landscapes of Iran could plausibly serve as locations for such a film. And Jack Kirby's fantastical artwork provided the perfect visual proof to show to any curious Iranian official. Mendez took the Lord of Light script, tore off the cover, and gave it a new, punchy title, Argo, a reference to the ship Jason and the Argonauts used on their mythical quest to retrieve the Golden Fleece. To complete the legend, they placed full-page ads in the Hollywood trade papers, Variety, and The Hollywood Reporter, announcing their upcoming film, complete with a tagline, A Cosmic Conflagration.
The success of this plan hinged on a unique and almost surreal convergence of disparate worlds. It required the highest levels of government cooperation, the Canadian Parliament had to hold its first secret session in history to authorize the issuance of fake Canadian passports for the 6 Americans, and President Carter had to sign a presidential finding to approve the covert operation. It required the insider expertise of Hollywood, provided by John Chambers, who knew exactly how to create the illusion of a film in pre-production. And most uniquely, it relied on the cultural artifacts of a specific moment in time. The plan was conceived in the wake of Star Wars, a film that had just transformed science fiction from a niche genre into a global cultural phenomenon. The idea of a Hollywood crew traveling to the ends of the earth to find the perfect exotic location for a sci-fi epic was suddenly not just plausible, it was fashionable. The CIA was weaponizing Hollywood's absurdity, using the cultural capital of science fiction to achieve a deadly serious geopolitical objective. The line between fiction and reality was being deliberately and brilliantly blurred.
In late January 1980, with the plan in place, Tony Mendez and Ed Johnson boarded a flight to Tehran. They carried with them the Argo script, copies of Jack Kirby's storyboards, and the meticulously forged documents that would transform 6 American diplomats into a Canadian film crew. At the same time, the Canadian government shipped the 6 official, but fraudulent, Canadian passports to their embassy in Tehran via secured diplomatic pouch. Mendez and Johnson arrived in Tehran on January 25th and met with Ambassador Taylor and the 6 nervous house guests. They had just 2 days to rehearse.
The diplomats, none of whom had any training in espionage, had to memorize their new identities, their fake job titles, producer, director, cameraman, scriptwriter, and the entire backstory of their non-existent film. They scrounged for clothes to match their new personas, trading their conservative diplomatic attire for a more Hollywood chic look, tighter trousers, silk shirts, and gold medallions. To test their nerve, a Canadian diplomat fluent in Farsi, dressed in military fatigues, conducted a surprise mock interrogation, grilling them on the details of their cover story to prepare them for a real encounter with the Revolutionary Guards.
The stakes could not have been higher. Failure would mean, at best, international embarrassment for the U.S. and Canada. At worst, it would mean the capture and likely execution of the 6 Americans and their CIA rescuers, and could potentially endanger the 52 hostages still held at the embassy. The night before the planned escape, Mendez sent a final cable to Washington and Ottawa, outlining the last details of the exfiltration. The response came back from CIA headquarters, a sign-off that has become legendary within the agency. President has just approved the finding. See you later, exfiltrator. The final act was about to begin.
3 a.m., January 27, 1980. The phone rings, jolting Tony Mendez from his sleep. It's the day of the escape. In the pre-dawn darkness of Tehran, the 8 members of the fake Studio 6 production crew make their way to Mehrabad International Airport. The airport is nearly empty, which they had hoped for. The early morning flight was chosen specifically because they gambled that even the most zealous Revolutionary Guards would be less alert at that hour.
The climax of this story, as depicted in Hollywood, is a dramatic, high-octane chase, with airport guards pursuing the hero's plane down the runway as it takes off. The reality was very different. It was a climax not of action, but of nerve. The tension was entirely internal, a silent battle waged in the minds of 6 diplomats who were not trained spies, forced to lie for their lives. They approached the first checkpoint, customs. Then the next, immigration. The real participants, including Mendez and Mark Lijek, would later describe the passage as tense but, incredibly, smooth as silk. The Iranian immigration officer, sleepy and uninterested, barely glanced at their meticulously forged Canadian passports and entry visas before stamping them through. A critical part of the plan's success lay in a simple, bureaucratic oversight the CIA had counted on. The airport officials rarely, if ever, cross-referenced the exit stamps in a passport with the original entry records filed away in a separate office. The lie held.
They were through. In the departure lounge, they browsed the gift shops, trying to look casual. But then, a heart-stopping announcement crackled over the airport's speakers. Their flight, Swissair 363 to Zurich, was delayed. A minor mechanical problem. For an hour that felt like a lifetime, they waited, their minds racing. Was it a trap? Had they been discovered at the last second? Tony Mendez sweated, but held his nerve, advising the group not to panic or try to use their backup tickets.
Finally, the flight was called again. This time, it was real. As they walked across the tarmac and boarded the McDonnell Douglas DC-8, one of the diplomats, Bob Anders, nudged Mendez. He pointed to the name painted on the side of the aircraft, Argo, the name of a canton in Switzerland. It was an impossible coincidence, a name that sounded uncannily like their fake movie, Argo. It felt like a sign.
The cabin doors closed. The jet taxied to the runway and began its powerful ascent. Inside, a collective, silent sigh of relief rippled through the small group of Americans. They were not safe yet. Only when the pilot's voice came over the intercom to announce that they had cleared Iranian airspace did the tension finally break. They had done it. They were free.
The celebration was quiet, subdued. They were still surrounded by strangers and didn't want to draw attention to themselves. Ed Johnson, the quiet linguist, casually picked up a copy of the International Herald Tribune and started doing the crossword puzzle. One of the clues was Jason's companions. The answer, of course, was the Argonauts. Another impossible coincidence.
The plane landed in Zurich, Switzerland. The 6 Americans were quickly and quietly met by other CIA operatives and whisked away to a mountain lodge safe house for the night. Their journey wasn't over. They would be driven to Ramstein Air Base in West Germany and then flown to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Their return to the U.S. kept secret for now, but their ordeal in Iran was finished. Simultaneously, back in Tehran, the final pieces of the Canadian caper fell into place. Ambassador Ken Taylor sent his last, triumphant cable to Ottawa, confirming that the house guests had departed safely and the mission was a success.
With that, the Canadian embassy was officially closed. The remaining staff prepared to leave. The final act belonged to the embassy's military head of security, Sergeant Claude Gauthier. He picked up a sledgehammer and, in a symbolic act of finality, smashed the embassy's communications equipment to pieces, ensuring no secrets were left behind. His actions earned him the nickname Sledge.
The power of this true story lies in the very absence of a Hollywood-style chase. The victory was not won with guns or explosions, but with creativity, meticulous planning, and extraordinary courage. It was a triumph of intelligence in both senses of the word. The cover story was so perfect, the forged documents so flawless, and the execution so nervy that it precluded the need for violence. This quiet, intellectual victory stands in stark and poignant contrast to the disastrous failed military rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, which the U.S. would attempt months later. That mission, an operation of brute force, would end in fire and death in the Iranian desert, with 8 American servicemen killed in a tragic accident, leaving the remaining hostages in even greater peril. The Canadian caper proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is a well-told lie.
The secret didn't last long. The day after the escape, the story broke. The world learned of the 6 escaped diplomats not from the U.S. or Canadian governments, but from a journalist who had demonstrated his own form of heroism. Jean Pelletier, the Washington correspondent for the Montreal newspaper La Presse, had pieced together the story weeks earlier. He knew the Canadians were hiding Americans. It was the scoop of a lifetime, but he made the courageous decision to sit on it, knowing that publishing it would put the 6 lives in jeopardy. Once he confirmed they were safely out of Iran, he ran the story.
The news exploded. In the United States, mired in the daily anxiety and frustration of the hostage crisis, the escape was a rare and desperately needed piece of good news. And the reaction was a massive, spontaneous, and heartfelt outpouring of gratitude for their neighbor to the north. Across the country, billboards and banners went up with a simple message: "Thank you, Canada." American television personalities and ordinary citizens alike hailed Canadian bravery. The Canadian flag was flown in cities and towns across the U.S. Ken Taylor, with his stylish suits and confident demeanor, became an instant international hero, the rakish mastermind of a daring plot. He would later be awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States.
For now, the CIA's central role remained a closely guarded secret. The U.S. government was content to let Canada take all the credit, and Canada, a country long accustomed to living in the shadow of its superpower neighbor, reveled in the appreciation.
In 2012, more than 3 decades after the escape, the story was told again, this time to a global audience of millions. Ben Affleck's film Argo was a critical and commercial triumph, a tense, masterfully crafted thriller that went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. The film brought the story of Tony Mendez and the Hollywood gambit to a new generation, cementing the operation in the public consciousness. It is, without question, a powerful piece of filmmaking. But it is not history.
In its quest for dramatic tension, Argo takes significant liberties with the truth, creating a version of events that, in many ways, misrepresents the very nature of the real operation. The most significant distortion is its portrayal of the Canadian role. The film relegates Ambassador Ken Taylor and his staff to the background, depicting them as little more than passive innkeepers, waiting to be rescued by the CIA. This portrayal deeply angered many Canadians, who felt their story of proactive courage had been stolen and minimized. The film completely erases John and Zena Sheardown, the couple who sheltered 4 of the 6 Americans at immense personal risk, a historical omission that even the film's director later acknowledged with regret.
The film invents entire sequences for dramatic effect. The tense trip to a Tehran bazaar to scout locations never happened. It would have been far too dangerous. The heart-pounding climax, the chase down the runway at Mehrabad, is pure fiction. The film also falsely depicts the desperate Americans being turned away by the British and New Zealand embassies, a detail that was not only untrue but also offensive to the diplomats from those countries who did provide assistance.
The reaction to the film was as complex as the history it portrayed. Many Americans celebrated it as a patriotic story of CIA heroism. But in Canada, the feeling was often one of frustration and hurt. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, while praising the film's entertainment value, delivered a pointed correction, stating that 90% of the contributions to the ideas and the consummation of the plan was Canadian. In Iran, the government and many citizens denounced the film as one-sided, anti-Iranian propaganda, criticizing its one-dimensional portrayal of Iranians as an irrational, fanatical mob, and announcing plans to make their own film to counter it.
The controversy over the film highlights a fascinating evolution in how this story has been told and remembered. For 17 years, from 1980 until 1997, there was only one public narrative, the Canadian Caper. It was a story of Canadian bravery and international friendship. The CIA's involvement was kept secret, a necessary deception to protect the 52 American hostages who remained in Tehran. During this time, Canada received, and unequivocally deserved, all of the credit and adulation.
Then, in 1997, the CIA declassified the files on Operation Argo. A new narrative emerged, one focused on the audacious American spy plot, the genius of Tony Mendez, and the surreal Hollywood cover story. This second narrative was solidified and amplified for a global audience by the 2012 film. For a new generation who had never heard of the Canadian Caper, the Argo story became the definitive version of events, effectively overriding the original narrative in the popular imagination.
The inaccuracies in the film Argo are not merely random Hollywood embellishments. They serve a specific narrative purpose that reflects a particular and revealing American worldview. The film is a powerful case study in how popular culture can reshape and even distort historical memory. By centralizing American agency, creating a lone wolf hero in Tony Mendez, and marginalizing foreign partners, the film crafts a story that is more palatable to a national audience accustomed to seeing America as the primary actor on the world stage. It substitutes the quiet, intellectual tension of a successful intelligence operation with the loud, familiar, and viscerally satisfying tropes of an action movie.
But the most profound and unspoken irony of the film lies in its framing. Argo opens with a brief, animated storyboard sequence that correctly identifies the 1953 Sci-Fi coup as the root cause of the 1979 revolution. The film acknowledges the original sin. Yet, the rest of its runtime is dedicated to celebrating the CIA as the heroic solution to the crisis. This creates a subtle but powerful act of historical alchemy. The film uses the undeniable heroism of the 1980 rescue mission to implicitly redeem the CIA for its disastrous intervention in 1953. It acknowledges the wound, and then presents the very institution that inflicted it as the surgeon who saves the patient. In doing so, Argo functions not just as entertainment, but as a form of national and institutional myth-making, crafting a cleaner, more heroic, and ultimately less complicated history for mass consumption.
In the end, the story of the escape from Tehran is a tangled web of history, where a single covert action in 1953 could send shockwaves through the decades, culminating in a revolution, a hostage crisis, an impossibly daring escape, and finally, a blockbuster movie that tells a version of the truth, but not the whole story. It reminds us that history is not just what happened, but who gets to tell the story. And it reveals the enduring power of a well-crafted narrative, a power that can be used not only to save lives in a moment of crisis, but to shape the memory of nations for generations to come.